In the spring of 1867, in a mining settlement in the Nevada hills, a woman arrived by stagecoach carrying a single carpet bag. She had answered a newspaper advertisement for a hotel housekeeper. The ad promised $12 a month, a shared room, and steady work. Within 2 weeks, she owed the house $40 she had no way to pay. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you are about to hear is not the version most people know. If this is your first time here, subscribe. We cover the real history behind the legends, and it is rarely what you learned in school. Before we go further, what do you think that woman did when she realized what the job actually was? Think about it honestly. Not what you would do. What could she actually do? With no money, no family in the territory, and no legal standing in that town. Keep that question in your mind as we go. Now, the word that gets used most often is soiled doves. It is a poetic phrase. It suggests something fragile, something that was once clean and became stained. It suggests a choice that went wrong. It paints a picture of a woman who fell, who stumbled, who perhaps made a mistake. It is almost gentle. It is also almost completely wrong. The phrase was invented by the men who ran the newspapers, the same newspapers that ran the fraudulent advertisements, the same papers that took money from the operators of the houses. The language was always part of the system, and the system was built to be invisible from the outside. Here is what the outside looked like. A cattle town in Kansas, 1871, Main Street, dry goods store, land office, 2 saloons, a church under construction. Families arriving weekly by wagon. Children playing near the water trough in the evening. A town that looked from the church steps on a Sunday morning like exactly what people had come west to build. 2 streets over, behind the main commercial block, was a row of small wooden buildings. Some had red lanterns. Some did not. The women inside those buildings paid rent on their rooms. They paid for their food. They paid a percentage to the house for every customer. They paid for their own dresses, their own soap, their own medicine, and everything they paid for came from the operator of the house at a price they did not set. But here's the problem. The prices were not fixed. They shifted. A room that cost $6 a week when a woman arrived might cost $9 3 months later. The dress she was told she needed for work, the one she did not own when she got there, and was therefore given on credit, could be repriced after the fact. The laudanum that helped her sleep, that was sold to her from the house supply, accumulated on her tab. A woman who worked every single day for a month might end the month owing more than she had when she started. This was not accidental. It was the mechanism. In 1863, a woman was brought to a silver mining settlement in Colorado after being told she would work as a waitress in a boarding house. She was 17. She had come from Missouri with 3 other women she met only on the journey. When she arrived and understood what the situation was, she tried to leave on the second day. The man who ran the establishment told her she owed him $14 for transport, food on the road, and the dress she was wearing. He did not threaten her with violence in that moment. He did not need to. He simply pointed out that there was nowhere to walk to. The nearest town of any size was 40 miles east. There was no stage for another 6 days. She had no money. She stayed. That pattern, transport debt, arrival debt, clothing debt, was the foundation. It did not need locked doors. It needed arithmetic. Now let us stop for a second and be clear about something that gets distorted constantly in how people talk about this era. The myth is simple. Women chose this life because they had no other options, but they chose it freely. They made the best of a hard situation. Some of them thrived, and the madams were tough, independent businesswomen who built something from nothing. Parts of that are true. The parts that are true matter but they are used to cover over the parts that are not, and that is where the myth does its damage. Yes, women had few options. Yes, some madams did accumulate real money and real local power. Yes, there were women who made deliberate calculations and decided this was survivable compared to alternatives. All of that is historically real. But here's what gets left out. Those women were not the majority. They were not even close to the majority. They were the exceptions. The exceptions got remembered because they were memorable, because they fought, or because they escaped, or because they accumulated enough wealth to become visible. The women who did not escape, who did not accumulate, who worked through their 20s in a series of cattle towns and mining settlements and died of syphilis complications at 32, those women did not get remembered. They got buried at the edge of the cemetery, sometimes without a name on the marker, and the town moved on. And this is where things change. Think about what syphilis meant in 1870. Think carefully. There was no penicillin. There was no effective treatment of any kind. Mercury compounds were used, mercury applied to the skin, mercury taken internally, and the treatment caused its own severe damage: hair loss, neurological effects, kidney damage. The disease progressed in stages over years. A woman might not know she had it for a long time. She might begin to show symptoms and be told by the house operator to keep working. Stopping work meant losing income. Losing income meant the debt grew larger. A woman in a mining settlement in Montana in 1875 walked into the doctor's office in town. She had been showing symptoms for several months. The doctor confirmed what she already suspected. He charged her $2 for the visit. He told her there was not much to be done. He suggested she might consider leaving the profession. She asked him where she should go and what she should live on. He did not have an answer for that. She went back to work. That is not a story about a woman making a free choice. That is a story about a woman with no exit. The lack of exit is the whole point. The system was designed around the absence of exit. So how did women end up in these situations in the first place? The newspapers. In the 1860s and 70s, Western settlements were desperate for population, and newspapers in eastern cities ran advertisements constantly. Ads for workers of all kinds: farm laborers, cooks, laundresses, domestics, waitresses, seamstresses. Some of these ads were genuine, many were not. The fraudulent ones targeted women who were already in difficult circumstances, women who were recently widowed, women who had lost factory work, young women from rural areas who had family situations bad enough that leaving seemed like the better option. The ads described specific jobs with specific wages. They described clean accommodations. They sometimes mentioned the opportunity for advancement. They were written to be believable. They were often placed by agents who received a fee for every woman they delivered to the house operator. A woman reading an advertisement for a cook position in a Western boarding house at $11 a month had no way to verify it. She could not write to the establishment and expect a reliable answer. She could not ask anyone in her community who had been there. She made a decision based on paper. And once she was on the stage or the train, once the miles were accumulating between her and everything she knew, the terms of the situation began to shift. The agent might mention, casually, that the position had changed slightly, that the boarding house had different needs now, that the wage was actually $9, not $11, but room and board were included, so it was really better. The reframing happened in stages, always before she had arrived, always when she was already in motion. By the time she arrived and understood fully what was being offered, the debt clock had already started. But it gets worse. Vagrancy laws. In most Western territories in this period, A woman without visible employment and without a male guardian could be charged with vagrancy. This sounds abstract until you think about what it meant in practice. A woman who tried to leave a house of prostitution, who had no money and no job offer waiting and no family in the territory, was legally vulnerable the moment she walked out the door. If she walked down the street in a town where the sheriff knew who she was and where she had worked, she could be arrested for vagrancy. She could be fined, and if she could not pay the fine, she could be jailed, and if she was jailed, the operator of the house sometimes paid the fine, which meant she owed the operator again, which meant she went back. This was not an accident of law. Law enforcement in cattle towns and mining settlements operated within a specific economic reality. The houses generated revenue. The sheriffs and marshals were sometimes paid directly by operators for a general maintenance of order, meaning keeping the women in the houses, keeping the customers feeling safe, and occasionally arresting a woman who was causing a problem. The arrangement was understood by everyone involved, even when it was never written down anywhere. A sheriff in a cattle town in 1868 did not see himself as participating in something corrupt. He saw himself as maintaining a system that kept the town functional. The men who came to town after the cattle drives needed somewhere to spend money. The money that got spent in those establishments circulated back into the local economy. The dry goods merchants knew it. The hotel operators knew it. The men who were building the church 2 streets over knew it and looked at a different section of sky when the subject came near. Think about who benefited from these arrangements, and you start to see why the myth was so durable. The operator benefited, obviously. But so did the town. A mining settlement that had a functioning commercial district with women available for entertainment was more attractive to workers than one that did not. Workers stayed longer. They spent more. The settlement grew. The people who owned land in the settlement saw that land increase in value. The owners of the dry goods stores and the hotels and the saloons all operated in an economy that was partly sustained by the houses. None of those people wanted to examine that too carefully. The church was an interesting case. In some settlements, donations came to the church from operators who wanted to maintain a surface of respectability. The donation was accepted. No formal acknowledgement was made of where it came from. The minister might preach on the subject of moral failing among women, might reference the existence of such establishments in terms of deep regret, might pray publicly for the souls of the women involved, and the building fund continued to receive its contribution. This is not a cynical point. It is a structural one. The economy of a frontier settlement in this period was deeply interconnected. The idea that one part of it could be cleanly separated from the rest was a comfortable fiction that served the people who needed that fiction. And what about the women themselves? Here is something that gets lost when the story gets reduced to either tragedy or romance. Women in these situations developed real communities with each other. They shared information. In a cattle town where women from multiple establishments had any contact with each other, on the street, in the shops, in the small informal networks that develop anywhere people live near each other, they traded knowledge. Which operators were worse than others? Which customers were dangerous? Where a woman might find a sympathetic ear, a doctor who would charge less, a boarding house that might take in a woman who needed to disappear for a few days. A woman in a mining settlement in Colorado in 1872 kept a small notebook. She wrote in it carefully names of men in town who had been violent, names of men who could be trusted, prices she was actually charged for things, week by week, which she compared against what she should have been charged. She could not use that information to escape immediately, but she kept it. She gave information from it to other women when they asked. The notebook was found years later by someone clearing out a building. The name on it meant nothing to anyone still alive. That woman, whoever she was participating in something that looked like resistance because it was resistance. It was small, incomplete, dangerous to have, and ultimately unable to change the structure she was living inside. But it was real. This is the part of the story that the Heart of Gold myth almost accidentally captures, and then completely distorts. The Heart of Gold narrative says, a woman in a brothel is secretly good, secretly kind, secretly generous, secretly hoping for rescue. It sentimentalizes her. It makes her sympathetic in a way that requires her to be passive, to be waiting, to be defined by her hope that a man will eventually see her true worth. What it misses is that women in these situations were active. They were calculating, often quite sharply. They were navigating a set of conditions that required real intelligence to survive. They were protecting each other in whatever ways they could. They were not waiting for goodness to be recognized. They were trying to find the edge of an exit that the system had deliberately sealed. A woman who had worked in a cattle town for 4 years managed in 1874 to accumulate enough cash, real cash kept separate from what the house knew about, to buy a stage ticket to a city 200 miles away. She arrived in that city with a different name. She found work as a laundress. She never went back. She never told anyone where she had been. No one who knew her in that new life ever knew her previous history. She became invisible in exactly the way the system had always assumed she would become invisible. But she did it on her own terms, which was not supposed to be possible. How many women did this? We do not know, because when it worked, it was invisible. We only know about the ones for whom it did not. But here is the problem. For every woman who got out, there were many who did not. The odds were built into the system. The debt structure, the legal vulnerability, the physical damage of the diseases, the dependency that alcohol and laudanum created, all of these were not separate problems. They compounded each other. A woman who was deep in debt also tended to be more dependent on laudanum because the laudanum was available from the house and it made the situation tolerable. A woman more dependent on laudanum found it harder to save money carefully, harder to plan, harder to maintain the discipline that escape required. The system fed on itself. Laudanum specifically is worth pausing on. Laudanum is opium dissolved in alcohol. It was legal. It was sold everywhere in this period, including by pharmacies in cities, but also by the operators of houses directly to the women who lived there. It helped with sleep. It helped with pain. It helped with the kind of grinding emotional numbness that allowed a person to keep moving through a situation she could not escape. And it was addictive in the way that opiates are addictive, profoundly, physically, in a way that made the absence of it acutely painful. An operator who sold laudanum to the women in his establishment was not necessarily thinking strategically about addiction in the way we might frame it now. He was responding to demand, but the effect was strategic regardless of intent. A woman who needed laudanum and could only reliably obtain it from the house was tied to the house by that need as surely as by any debt. This is where the story gets very quiet and very uncomfortable. These were not exceptional circumstances. They were the normal operating conditions of many establishments across the frontier territories in this period. The disease, the debt, the chemical dependency, the legal vulnerability, all of it was normal. Not in the sense that it was acceptable, but in the sense that it was expected, routine, built into the structure of how these places operated. And here's the question I want you to sit with for a moment. If this was the normal condition, who was responsible for maintaining it? not just the operators, not just the corrupt sheriffs. Think about the cattle drivers who were the customers. Think about the merchants who served those drivers and lived on that commerce. Think about the editors who published the fraudulent ads and also published editorials about the moral condition of frontier women. Think about the men building the church who accepted the donation from the operator. Think about the men who wrote the vagrancy laws, and the men who enforced them, and the men who designed those laws, knowing how they would be used. The system was not maintained by one bad actor. It was maintained by a dense web of ordinary economic interests and social arrangements and careful collective silence. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is the accurate one. Now let us talk about what actually happened to most women. The romantic version of the story, the one that persists in films and novels and popular histories, contains a standard character arc. A woman arrives in difficult circumstances. She is tough, she is sharp, she is funny, she accumulates some resources. She has complicated relationships with men who both need her and cannot quite respect her. She eventually either escapes to a new life, or she dies with a kind of tragic dignity mourned by the community she served. The actual statistical reality was different. Most women who worked in frontier brothels for any significant period of time did not live long lives. The diseases took years to kill, but they killed. Syphilis, in its late stages, causes neurological damage, confusion, loss of coordination, behavioral changes, and then death. Gonorrhea caused chronic infections that led to serious complications. In the absence of any effective treatment, these were not manageable conditions. They were slow death sentences with uncertain timing. Alcohol damaged the liver. Laudanum dependency, in its severe forms, caused physical deterioration that was visible and rapid. Women who had been in the system for more than 5 or 6 years often showed it in the way they moved, the way they looked, the wear of it that did not come from any single event but from the accumulation of everything. A woman who died in a mining settlement at the age of 31 was buried without ceremony at the eastern edge of the cemetery, the section reserved for people who died outside the church's formal membership, the unbaptized infants, the men hanged for crimes, the women from the houses. The grave markers in that section were sometimes wooden, sometimes not there at all. The town's cemetery records listed her occupation as uncertain. Her hometown was listed as unknown. Her name might be correct, or might be the name she had given when she arrived, which might not be her own. That is how most of the story ends. Not with escape, not with dignity, with a wooden marker or no marker, and a town record that lists nothing certain. This is what the soiled dove mythology erases. It replaces the wooden marker with a story. The story has feeling in it, and romance, and the comfort of narrative arc. The actual history has a grave at the edge of a cemetery that no one visits because no one knows whose it is. And this is where things change again. Because understanding who benefited from that mythology makes it impossible to see the mythology as accidental. Consider what the romantic version of this history accomplishes. It makes the women appear to have chosen their situations. It gives the men who use those establishments a narrative that softens their role. They were not exploiting trapped women. They were visiting women who had chosen this life and in some cases built something from it. It gives the town, operators, and merchants a version of history in which the economic arrangements were unfortunate but not criminal. It gives the church a story in which these women were fallen but potentially redeemable, which made the church's relationship to them morally coherent. Everyone who needed the myth got something from it. The women themselves got nothing from it. The myth was not for them. It was constructed around them and over them, and it had the effect of making their actual experience harder to see. A woman who tried to tell someone what was actually happening inside the house, the debt structure, the repriced goods, the laudanum supply, the violence that was quiet and routine, was already in a position where her account would be treated skeptically. She was not a reliable narrator in the eyes of the law or the press. She was a soiled dove. Her testimony about her own conditions was not the kind of testimony that got taken seriously in a territorial court. So let us be clear about what the myth accomplished legally. A woman could not sign a contract in most territories without a male co-signer. She could not own property. She could not bring a legal complaint about the conditions of her employment because she had no legal employment. What she was doing was either technically illegal or operated in a gray zone that gave her no formal standing. If she was assaulted by a customer and went to the sheriff, the outcome depended entirely on whether the sheriff valued the ongoing arrangement with the house operator more than the woman's complaint. In most cases, the arrangement won. A miner in Nevada in 1869 refused to pay for services he had already received. A brief confrontation occurred. The woman was struck. She had bruising across her face the next morning. The operator told her not to go out in public until it faded. He also told her the miner had been a valued customer and that she should not make the situation more complicated. She did not go to the sheriff. She already knew what would happen if she did. The violence was not the exception. It was present with the regularity of the weather, not constant, not every day, but frequent enough to be expected, managed, absorbed. Women developed ways of reading customers the moment they arrived, the tone of the voice, the way they carried themselves, whether they had been drinking, and how much, whether there was something in the eyes that was off. That reading was a survival skill. It was not always sufficient, but it gets worse. Here is the part that is almost never discussed. Some of the women who ran establishments, the madams, the operators in female form, had themselves come through the system. They had experienced the debt structure and the disease and the violence and had survived it and accumulated enough to run their own places. And some of them ran their establishments using the same mechanisms they had been subjected to. This is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be, because it shows something important about how thoroughly closed the system was. A woman who had lived inside the structure, who understood it from the inside, who had every reason to build something different, sometimes built the same thing, because the same thing worked economically, because the alternatives were harder to sustain, because the economic logic of the debt system and the laudanum supply was difficult to simply set aside when you were trying to run a business in a competitive market. This does not make those women villains in a simple sense. It makes them people who were operating inside a system that shaped behavior at every level, even among people who had every personal reason to resist it. And this is the point where the history becomes genuinely hard to look at directly. The system produced its outcomes regardless of the intentions of the individuals inside it. Good intentions did not cancel the debt structure. Personal kindness from an operator did not change the legal vulnerability of the women. A madam who genuinely liked the women in her house and tried to treat them less badly was still running a system that captured them through debt and held them through that debt and through the absence of legal options. The kindness was real. The mechanism was also real. Both things were true at the same time. Now let us talk about the women who made it out, because some did. Not enough. Not most. But some. The ones who made it out largely did so through silence. They arrived somewhere new with a new name, or no name at all, and they made themselves legible to a new community in a completely different way. They found work, laundry, seamstress work, domestic service that was hard and poorly paid, but that existed outside the closed loop. They did not tell anyone where they had been. They built a new surface carefully and maintained it. A woman who had worked in a cattle town for 2 years arrived in a city in the Midwest in 1873. She found work as a seamstress in a shop that made ladies' clothing. She was good at the work. Within 3 years, she had enough saved to rent her own small room independently. She attended a church on Sundays. She was quiet, she was reliable, she was known in her neighborhood as a serious woman. She died in 1914 at the age of 67. Her obituary mentioned her work in the garment trade and her years of church attendance. It mentioned nothing else. That silence was not shame alone, it was also protection. The world she had moved into had no place for the story she carried. Telling it would have destroyed the life she had rebuilt, so she carried it in silence for 40 years, and when she died, it went with her. This is what escape looked like when it worked. It looked like disappearance. It looked like a woman who, to everyone around her, had simply appeared one day, reliable and quiet, without a past that anyone could see. Think about this for a moment. What did the communities that built themselves on this system owe to the women it consumed? What would accountability have even looked like in that context? These are not comfortable questions. They are the ones this history keeps raising. The newspaper advertisement system was not random or disorganized. In larger eastern cities, there were agents, sometimes called employment brokers, who specialized in placing women in Western establishments. They operated openly. They were paid per placement. A woman who came to one of these brokers looking for domestic work in the West was interviewed, was given information about a specific position, was sometimes provided with transport money that was framed as an advance on her wages. The advance on wages was, of course, the first component of the debt that was waiting for her at the other end. The brokers were not always male. Some were women who had themselves come through the system and had found that the broker role paid better and was safer than remaining in a house. They were effective because they were credible to the women they were recruiting. A woman who might be skeptical of a male agent promising domestic work in a Nevada mining settlement might be less skeptical of a woman who described the work in practical terms, who seemed to understand the concerns being raised, who offered reassurances that felt specific and grounded. The reassurances were specific and grounded because the broker knew exactly what she was describing. She knew what the conditions would be. She was describing them in the language of legitimacy while delivering the person into the mechanism. This is not a comfortable piece of the history, but it belongs in the history. And here is the third question, the one that belongs near the end of this. When you think about what justice would have looked like for these women, what accountability would have required from the towns, the operators, the brokers, the physicians who certified their commitments when husbands needed a legal tool, the newspapers that took advertising money while knowing what the ads were for, what form does that accountability take? Because it never came, not in any organized or sufficient way. The frontier closed. The settlements became towns. The towns became cities. The men who had built the debt system built legitimate businesses with the money it generated. Their names are on buildings. Their descendants became prominent. And the women who powered the mechanism that generated that money are in unmarked graves at the edges of cemeteries in states that have been renamed twice since those women died. The reform movements that did exist in this era were real, and some of them helped specific individuals in specific situations. Religious organizations established missions in some frontier settlements specifically to offer women a way out of these establishments. The mission model had problems of its own. It required women to perform a specific kind of public repentance that many found degrading, and it offered resources that were often inadequate for what the women needed. But the intent was genuine in many cases, and some women used these missions as an actual exit point. A woman in a cattle town in 1878 walked through the door of a mission that had opened 3 months earlier. She had been in the territory for 4 years. She had been trying to pay off a debt that had not decreased meaningfully in that time. She sat down across from the mission director and told him, in practical terms, what her situation was, the debt amount, the way the prices shifted, the mechanism that kept the number from going down. The director wrote down the amount. He paid it. She left that day. She spent 2 years at the mission, learning to read with full competency and doing laundry work for the mission's operations. She eventually moved to a different territory and worked as a school teacher. That happened. It happened for some women. The mission director in that story was one person who chose to treat the situation as a financial and legal problem rather than a moral one. He paid the debt. He did not demand repentance. He provided the specific thing that the specific situation required. He was unusual. The system did not reward that approach and did not produce many people like him. The women who did not get a mission. Director who thought clearly about the problem, who did not get the customer, who offered something real rather than promises, who did not find the one moment when the arithmetic of escape aligned. Those women stayed. They aged inside the system. At some point, the system decided they were no longer useful. What happened after that depended on circumstances that were almost entirely outside their control. Some ended up in county poorhouses, the frontier-era equivalent of a welfare institution, underfunded and harsh, that housed people who had no other option and no resources. The poorhouses of the frontier territories were not well-documented institutions. The people inside them were not well-documented people. A woman who arrived at a county poorhouse with no money, no connections, and no history that she was willing to disclose received the minimum that the institution provided and lived out whatever time remained in conditions that were difficult in their own different ways. Some ended up caring for women in a worse position than themselves. That dynamic appeared in some of the documentary records. Older women who had come through the system and remained connected to it in some capacity, providing care for younger women who were currently in it, not as operators, as something closer to informal nurses, changing dressings, sitting with women who were dying, making sure the dying had something to drink and someone in the room. The mutual aid that existed in these spaces was real, and it mattered, even though it could not fix the structural conditions that made mutual aid necessary. Women who had nothing gave what they had. That is historically true, and it should be said clearly. And this is where we reach the end. The soiled dove mythology was constructed to serve the people who benefited from the system. And it worked because it was built into the language before anyone thought to examine it. Soiled. Fallen. The contamination located in the women themselves, not in the mechanism. Not in the fake advertisement, not in the debt that could not be paid down, not in the law that offered no protection, not in the corrupt sheriff, not in the customer, not in the operator. The myth said these women had made a choice. The reality was a wall. A very specifically constructed wall with economic, legal, and social components that had been deliberately assembled by people who understood what they were building. A woman in a Wyoming settlement in 1881 was found dead in her room on a Thursday morning. She had been sick for 2 months. The cause of death was listed as fever, which covered everything and specified nothing. She was 34 years old. She was buried 2 days later. 5 other women from the house attended. The operator paid for the coffin because the county would have provided something cheaper. Her name in the burial record is a first name only. Where she came from is listed as not known. That is the end of the soiled dove story. Not the wink in the whiskey glass. Not the heart of gold, a woman who was 34, who had a first name that may or may not have been her own, who died of something the record did not specify, and who had 5 people at her burial who knew her and nobody else. Mystery Wild West does not tell you the comfortable version. It tells you the real one, and that is where we leave it today.